All right, Steve's talking about the colossal fall of Oprah Winfrey.
Winfrey. And now I'm talking about just not just specifically about one of the biggest controversies that's gripped our nation of late and her involvement in that, but this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the controversies that she's been involved with for the past several years. So let's just start with her latest endorsement of a very controversial book for her highly successful book club. The book is called Caste, C-A-S-T-E. And what the author reportedly argues is that the United States is systematically akin to oppressive political and economic systems that we find, for example, in India's traditional caste system. So in this sense, then, the United States appropriates race and defines race in relation to a social hierarchy, with whites on the top and African Americans confined to the bottom, deliberately, of this hierarchy. And the book goes on to make comparisons to the American social order, not simply to the caste system of India, but also to Nazi Germany. And Oprah is pushing this. Not only does she claim that it was one of the most important books she's ever read, but she's actually calling on literally all of humanity to read this book as well. Now, this isn't the first time that Oprah got into a bit of a pickle with regard to rather strange picks for her book club. You may remember the so-called American Dirt controversy. It was an interesting controversy, analytically speaking, that is, that Oprah got herself into. She pushed big time a book entitled American Dirt. It was a fictional account of a Mexican migrant who went into the United States illegally. She's being chased by drug cartels and the like. But the controversy surrounded the fact that the book was written by a so-called European-born woman living in the United States who had no ties whatsoever to the Mexican migrant experience. And a lot of critics were angered by what they considered this author's use of offensive Latino stereotypes, right? You live by PC, you die by PC, I guess. And so Oprah was forced to backtrack on the book. And in effect, she had to admit that she was totally blind to these racial stereotypes herself. But the damage was already done, and she was widely accused of having helped perpetuate what liberal critics saw as a blatant and obvious example of opportunistic cultural appropriation on the part of this author. And yet, Oprah has no problem lecturing the rest of us on our supposed insensitivity towards racial stereotypes and our unconscious or deliberate biases or whatever. And this is all coming on the heels of a very clear pivot of late for Oprah, who's appearing very much inclined to embracing the new wokeness, the new racial narrative that has pervaded our national discourse since the death of George Floyd. So shortly after the riots broke out, Oprah hosted an episode on her Apple TV Plus series where she pushed relentlessly this notion of white privilege. And when guests came on pointing out, the rather inconvenient fact that not all white people have power. There are plenty of white people who are underprivileged, right? Living in adverse conditions. Hardly the paragon of white privilege when you're underprivileged. Even though that was pointed out to Oprah, she nevertheless responded saying that, and I'm quoting her, there are white people who are not as powerful as the system of white people. Here's that term, the caste system that's been put in place. But they still, no matter where they are on the rung or the ladder of success, they still have their whiteness. You still have your whiteness. That's what the term white privilege is. It means that whiteness still gives you an advantage no matter, close quote. Now, obviously, she was mercilessly brutalized for that comment. Here you have a woman that's worth over $2 billion. And not only does she have the goal of lecturing the rest of us on privilege, or white privilege for that matter, she has the goal to lecture us about poor people benefiting from white privilege, the underprivileged benefiting from privilege, right? She doesn't seem to give a rip about their poverty-stricken lives. She's been so blinded to their sufferings and adversities by this racial stereotype. And then, of course, not to be outdone, Oprah has gotten deeply involved in the very controversial 1619 project. It's a so-called history project that doesn't, as it turns out, have any historians involved with it. It's being pushed by the so-called journalists at the New York Times.
I've said, I can't stand the gal, and I don't like her thinking and those connected with her, unfortunately. But the fact is, conservatives and other individuals are not going to put up with this foolishness. They're not going to put up with the show. Her ratings will fall. she has already lost money in her network, and she will continue to lose money with it. It will not grow like she has hoped for, and she will attract a lot of liberal-minded people. But a lot of conservatives will fight it and resist it and stay away from it and have nothing to do with her. And she'll find herself in a minority. Wait and see. This liberal power, this liberal money, this liberal bias will only go so far. It's not in a majority. It's Roger Martin from Billings, Montana, and thank you, Steve Turley.